Web3 and blockchain technologies have the potential to change the business landscape. As we begin the shift to the Web3 era, one obvious question that arises is, what does all this mean for the enterprise? Furthermore, how does governance work across ecosystems? Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the impact of Web3 and blockchain technologies on business, government, and society. I am your host, Doug Heintzman. I'm the Chief Catalyst at the Blockchain Research Institute. In this episode, we're going to try to answer the basic questions of what Web3's impact is going to be on the enterprise. To help us with this discussion, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Jerry Cuomo to the podcast. Jerry is an IBM Fellow, Vice President and CTO of Technology at IBM. He's the host of Think Blockchain podcast, author of Blockchain for Business, and Think Blockchain, a student's guide to blockchain's evolution from Bitcoin, Ethereum, Hyperledger to Web3. Welcome to the podcast, Jerry.
Hey, Doug. Good to see you. Good to hear from you.
Indeed. Yeah, and I suppose as a disclosure, Jerry and I worked together for years and years and years at IBM back in the day. But Jerry's also the author of Blockchain for Business, which is a wonderful book. Came out in, I think, 2019 or so.
That's right. And
if I remember, our very own Don Tapscott at the Blockchain Research Institute wrote the foreword for that, didn't he?
That's right. Yes, he did. He certainly did.
He is also the author of a pretty new book, just came out a couple months ago, called Think Blockchain, a student's guide to blockchain's evolution from Bitcoin, Ethereum, Hyperledger to Web3. So, Jared, I thought we'd actually start this conversation right there. I was looking. I haven't read the book yet, but it's on my list. But from the first look I took at it, it's not your typical technology business book, right? This is a slightly different spin on things. And so, just right off the top, why don't you just kind of explain what your thinking was about and what your intention is with this book? But because I think that'll lead us into some interesting conversations about Web3.
Yeah, sure, Doug. My pleasure. So it starts with the pandemic, and I found myself home quite a bit, but then starting to break out to the office. And IBM has a small recruiting office at North Carolina State University. So hanging out there, I got to listen to some of the students and teachers, what was trending. And we were talking about cybersecurity, and they always had blockchain questions to ask me. And we had some fun with it. And then they dropped the big question on me, which is, hey, you seem to really like this stuff. Would you like to teach a course this fall? And I said, oh my gosh, that would be the coolest thing on cybersecurity and blockchain. So Doug, I said, I'm all in. And it sounded like a good idea for about 24 hours until the fear and panic struck. I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do that? And it's like the difference between, watching your nephew for a weekend versus having children of your own. This is not just a one class, come in and do a guest lecture thing. So to answer your question, what's different about this book is I decided to gather some of my material on blockchain. And quite honestly, Doug, I found it to be quite one-sided, a bit lopsided, very much on the enterprise side, which I wanted to put to the test. So what I did was it gave me an opportunity, not having to travel as much and drive back and forth to the office, to pull my material together, but do some homework, but that quite frankly, I should probably have done a long time ago, to look at blockchain as if I were teaching it to a student and to think about it first from its basics. Where did it start? Why did it start? What were the breakthroughs of Bitcoin, Ethereum? What were we trying to accomplish with Hyperledger? Where are its successes? Where does it need work? Because, I found myself imagining being in front of a class, and I couldn't start from the fifth chapter. I really had to start from chapter 1. So it's not your typical business or student or technical guide, although it is very much that. I try to break it down in a less biased way than I think I've been approaching blockchain in the past. But I think in that I kind of come full circle about the value of this technology it's a possibility for mankind and for, propelling the next generation of the internet, i.e. Web3, to its next stage in life.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that, because the bit about, going back to basics, because I find myself really trying to resist that, right? The whole discussion of why blockchain isn't the same as Bitcoin, and the whole, hashing and blocking and all the kind of technology side. I find myself really wanting and actually having many more of the higher value add conversations about how this technology is going to be used, right? What happens when a state engine, right? The remembering of things, the record of transactions, the data that provides context to the transaction. What happens when that is an inherent characteristic of the network and not something that is owned by a private company or a third party, right? What kinds of business systems can you build on it? So I find myself having the conversations with our membership and with companies and governments around the world about what the potential of the business is, what you're just kind of getting to.
That's right.
And that's really exciting. So why don't we start, or why don't we kind of go there?
Sure.
It was a few years ago that every company had to have, a blockchain center of excellence, and they had a bunch of blockchain projects, and they were kind of walking around the world with hammers looking for nails. And then a lot of people realized, well, wait a second, it's not the be all and end all for everything. And a lot of the projects didn't quite, pan out. And, you've got the typical overinvestment of an early hype cycle, situation. And then came along the crypto marketplace that started to show us the potential of composability, right? Of the fact that so many, interesting innovations that could address very, very distinct niches in a marketplace and be combined in all kinds of weird and wonderful configurations really started to show us the potential of this technology. So how do you see, or when do you see this technology, the Web3 blockchain technologies, coming back and starting to be truly impactful in the enterprise?
Sure. I'd venture to say, Doug, we're seeing it. And the question is, are we seeing it at scale? And I think that's the part that we have to really focus on. How do we get scale to some of these activities? When I look at what has been successful, I call it Web 2.5 sometimes, just for joking around, saying, we've been now well into, if you look at, when Don first wrote the book and the years that passed, we've had, as you said, some really good hype around blockchain in the enterprise, some really good projects, but 90% of those projects evaporated over time. As soon as there was a little hiccup or the next cool thing that came out, the budgets were shifted over to that or eliminated.
Yeah, squirrel.
So what survived is one of the questions, and why? And I see three areas that keep coming back from an enterprise perspective, but even beyond the core value proposition as we strive towards Web3. So what we learned from Web 2.5 was digital identity matters to enterprises and to their users. Digital assets matter. And I think that's the beauty of going from Bitcoin to Ethereum to Hyperledger, whereas Bitcoin kind of laid down the groundwork, but it was very fixed in purpose. It was about currency and transaction exchanges around currency. Then we have, an EVM, a smart contract inserted in between your transaction, and now you can implement a much broader set of transaction logic and digital assets as a result. So, and then, with Hyperledger really bringing it to a more enterprise with more accountability around network membership. So identity, digital assets, and ecosystems. Those are the big three things that I see have endured to this next round. And the thing when I say ecosystem, I have fun sometime linking it to metaverse, but it's not necessarily the traditional like immersive 3D that we would think of when we think of metaverse, although there's nothing wrong with that. I think of combining ecosystems like we did around the Trust Your Supplier network, which is a pretty cool story, Doug. 30 seconds, if you don't mind.
Sure, of course.
During the pandemic, what we saw was supply chain issues, as you know. And some of the reasons for the supply chain issues weren't that there weren't suppliers. It was just that buyers didn't have the flexibility to onboard them into their ecosystem. And, in IBM's case, we have a process that takes about 40 days to onboard a new supplier as a buyer. And it's not very different if you look at Lenovo or Cisco or some of the companies, Oracle, like us. It's about the same. And there's real reasons why it takes the vetting of a new supplier, and it protects the supply chain by knowing who you're doing business with. But the question is, if there's a trust relationship between IBM and Lenovo, or IBM, Lenovo, and Cisco, if that supplier wants to sign on with the second company, does it need to take them 40 days? And let's say maybe it only takes them 5 days. And the Trust Your Supplier network does exactly that. It builds a trust relationship between buyers and suppliers. What it does in the end is it makes more suppliers available to buyers and makes more buyers available to suppliers without unnecessary delays. And the cost of speed isn't a loss of security. So you're not losing security by gaining speed. And this is I would say the third area around supply chain that I see projects that worked in and around, I would say, business networks that already kind of existed, and building that trust and transparency that you get through a blockchain is still making a very big difference. So identity, digital assets, and these, I would say, aggregated ecosystems like we're seeing in some of these shared supply chains, to me, those are the things that took roots in going beyond Web 2.0 as we started introducing projects like the Hyperledger project and some of the sub-projects under that, like Hyperledger Fabric. Still have ways to go, and we can talk about some of the uphill climbs that we have, but I see those kind of ushering in the next round as we sprint towards Web 3. Okay, so boy, there's a whole bunch of topics wrapped up into what you just said that I'd love to explore in more detail. And right off the top, I think supply chain is actually is a good example of the problem to be solved. I think the pandemic exposed just how fragile the supply chains are, and the radical shifts that we've seen in the geopolitical environment as well as the lingering effects of the pandemic have caused all kinds of disruptions, and people are thinking about how do we restructure them, how do we rebuild them, and how do we make them a whole bunch more resilient and adaptive than they've been in the past. And I think naturally we're going to look for some new, enabling infrastructure to make that happen. And, voila, we have blockchain. But it does kind of go to two questions I'd like to explore, right? One is this ecosystem concept, because I think you're exactly right that one of the amazing things that this Web3 technology enables is it allows ecosystems to form much more quickly, to be more adaptive, to reconfigure themselves, to shed excess much more efficiently, and to innovate as a whole much more quickly. And that's really exciting. But it leads us to this, the essential consortium dilemma that, whenever you try to get economic actors to, work together, you have to go through an alignment of interest process. Now, part of that's the vetting process that you just talked about, but the really successful ecosystems are those that the wealth created by the ecosystem is equitably distributed to the people producing value to the ecosystem. And you're going to need some sort of governance that people have, confidence in, that will allow them to act efficiently as an ecosystem. And, this is, you and I have both been involved in a lot of consortium work and standards work in the past, and the herding cats exercise looks like. But one of the really exciting things for me about Web3 is, and you mentioned digital assets, one of the digital asset types are these governance tokens, right? The ability for stakeholders to express their
interests and priorities in the ecosystem in a very efficient way and even in an automated kind of way. So can we just spend a few minutes talking about, governance, the need for governance and the potential of Web3 blockchain technologies to, provide us the tools to build the governance that we're going to need in an ecosystem economy? Sure.
And let me maybe start with kind of what I see as a North Star here. And it's when I think of a ecosystem, there are lots of closed ecosystems that seem like they're healthy, vibrant ecosystems. I mean, I'm a vibrant coffee drinker and I love to drink things like Starbucks, and my Starbucks points mean a lot to me. It's good as cash in my mind. And same thing with my airline miles and my hotel points and all of that. But when you look at those ecosystems, it's not very easy to, how many Delta airline miles or Air Canada airline miles can you exchange for a cup of coffee? It's there. Those ecosystems are locked, and the value is locked in them.
I've also probably had more expire than I have used.
That's right. So. And just as an example, I'm pushing on the term ecosystem and open ecosystem or closed ecosystem. So imagine an open ecosystem where you can freely exchange these tokens. These loyalty tokens, and similar ecosystems exist. Like when you look at social media, I mean, you put out a post and you really hit the point, or it's a very controversial point, and you get tens of thousands of hits, of views, of likes. And, that company is making a lot of money on that digital asset that you've created through advertising. And then you go to, let's say, like, I haven't started my TikTok account yet, but I know when I start, I'm going to start from scratch. I can't bring my reputation with me. I can't bring my follower, my likes with me. I got to start over from scratch. So imagine a world where there's an converged ecosystem where those things start to align. Now, the question is certainly I can see as a user why the user sees value in that. The question is, how do companies see value in sharing and converging ecosystems, right? And I think that's where 101 says, start where you already have relationships. That's why supply chain has been such a vibrant place to start blockchain networks, because there is an implied governance model around the supply chain as it is. And what you're trying to do is upgrade the supply chain. Think about version 2 to version 3, and fix problems that exist in the prior version. So one of the problems might be dispute management. Well, onboarding, we just talked about onboarding buyers and suppliers, but another one might be dispute management. So how can we reduce the time it takes to settle a dispute on a supply chain? And now, like, when you have a particular problem like that, and this is a problem we've solved a few years ago on one of our supply chain networks that we participate in IBM, is blockchain doesn't eliminate disputes in a supply chain, but by sharing your data across different members of that supply chain, when it comes time to dispute, we found that, what typically takes around 35 days to resolve, because of all of the pairwise work that you have to do to resolve the dispute. Now, because there's a single system of truth, in about 9 days or less, you can resolve that dispute on a blockchain. So the participants in the network, that's an improvement. That's a significant, over 2 to 3x improvement. And when you can resolve a dispute that quickly in a supply chain, that means money isn't tied up. There's value that puts value back into the ecosystem. And that's a reason to want to do more. So aligned, finding the alignment between the businesses, finding existing governance and how to expand that to be a more shared model. I think that's natural places we see. I think we've seen people trying to hit walk-on grand slams, and those are hard to do, right? So one thing is, and we should continue to explore some of the bigger thoughts around, governance tokens and things like that. But I also think as we burn the candle from that end, we should just continue to burn the candle from how are we doing business today and where can we improve it by, collapsing walls and sharing more across those ecosystems. And we see this in financial services around, disseminating fraud data. I mean, that's already something that companies do in the financial services markets. How can we do that more broadly? How can we do that more quickly? And what are the rules to do it? And Doug, the last thing I can say is the biggest inhibitor, and tokens don't get around this on one side, and existing networks don't really help on the other side, and that's liability. So in the end, if it was my trust verification that led a supplier into the network who turns out to be non-trustworthy, and another buyer gets burnt by them, who's liable for that? Yeah. And how does the governance rules deal with situations like that? And that's usually the bane of existence, working out those edge cases. And sometimes, let's say sometimes, almost certainly, those are very difficult to express in smart contracts. So legal contracts come into play very strongly. Yeah.
So boy, you touched on it. I think that the metaphor I've always kind of gone to in this discussion is, the future of transportation. And, in a world of automated vehicles, when you do have an accident, right, where does accountability lead, right? I mean, is it that, do you sue an algorithm? Do you sue a programmer? Do you, or how do the smart contracts just incorporate all of the IoT information and then decide how to, distribute responsibility and payments? That it gets very ambiguous.
Yeah.
And the point you just on about smart contracts, I think is important too, because, you were talking earlier about the supply chain and dealing with conflicts. And yes, the fact that there is a common ledger and we don't have to do all the data reconciliation or argue about, who's got the right record of things. You've got a common version of the truth. It ought to be a whole bunch easier to figure out what happened and what should happen going forward. The other part of that is that hopefully a whole bunch of that's going to be avoided because so much of the governance is encoded into smart contracts. And there's just a whole bunch of automated things that happen between systems. And the governance was decided, up front and beforehand. And it'll be the exception that you kind of step out of that world and have to arbitrate a disagreement. Yeah. But to me, you were talking about the language and I suppose right down to the syntax level, that in certain domains, like the automotive domain or the supply chain domain or a governmental domain, there are, different rules. There are different social contracts. There are different, governance structures that, the people that participate in those ecosystems will kind of assume are the norm just because they're different domains. Does this suggest that we're going to have another level of, let's call it a smart contract templating that says that for this particular domain or that particular domain, there are a bunch of archetypical templates that in this context, these words mean these things. And, these are the basic commonly accepted smart contract conditions and that everyone kind of, adheres to them because... Yeah. How do you see that thing evolving?
Yeah. So one of the things that we see, well, first of all, just my little thing about smart contracts, and we kind of discuss this in the book. I think it's well known that smart contracts are not very smart. They're literally strict to the letter of the code. They can't assess judgment or lenience or interpreting the spirit of the contract. And so there's ways to go to truly make the contract smart. So in the meantime, there's also humans to intermediate. So when we see governance teams come together, there's a couple of tricks that make it more successful than not. The first is to find a way to write your contracts in a way that you can create them through a specification approach, like a higher level language, maybe a rules-based language that allows a broader audience to reason about them and then have a way to generate code from that is repeatable. And it's not that you have a bulletproof contract, but where, what the rules were that you were trying to achieve in the contract. So have that higher level specification. So don't just leave it to a developer. Have a meet in the middle someplace of a text, and sometimes a Microsoft Word document could take the text, could take the place there of that. But so now it's more of a spec. But it's great to have a spec that can be generated down to the next level. This way, there's more traceability in the creation of the contract. Okay, this was the intent. This is how the intent made its way into code, and that goes a very long way in helping the key steering committee of that ecosystem aligned. And that's half the battle right there. I'll pause just to take a break.
The metaphor that I always kind of go back to in this conversation is the U.S. military during, might have been World War II. It was one of the wars that they were involved in. They'd send out their orders on these standardized forms that said, go and take this hill, right? And so get your guys together and off you go and you take the hill, and you do all the military stuff to get the top of the hill. There's the standard orders, but one fellow figured out that actually wasn't terribly efficient. And the great innovation was that they always reserved a box in the top right-hand corner of the orders that spelled out the objective, right? That said, these are the orders, take That's five right. guys and go and do this, but this is the objective. We're trying to disrupt a communications line or a supply line or whatever, that with the context for the instructions, the effectiveness was so much greater because it allowed the field commanders to adapt, right? And to make field level decisions.
That's right.
It seems to me...
Perfect example, yeah.
It seems to me the same kind of thing is needed in the smart contract world, where there's this kind of and maybe it's part of that template I was referring to, that there's the objective of what we're trying to accomplish, and then here's a bunch of rules. And it could be that, we didn't think of everything, we wrote the rules down, but as long as we understand what the objective is, we have some flexibility. Do you think that can happen?
Perfect. Yes, it could and should and needs to happen. But you see the point here is that there is levels of interpretation that have to occur. And the bigger the group, the more global this network is, the less you want to leave in that level of interpretation to the beholder, right? You want to be able to carry from the top line all the way to the implementation. The other thing, Doug, around this is when you think about governance, I've sat through governance committees of all sorts. There's usually separations of concerns or specialties when assembling, a converged ecosystem around a blockchain. Things like, the IT committee, they worry about conforming to regulations like, making sure you have your SOX 2 certification, making sure all of the GDPR rules are being met. Those things don't go away because you're working on a blockchain. Right. And so how is your IT system going to conform? Then there is the other side, the business side, that might be thinking about the various roles of network members and what the incentive is to play that role. I mean, is there a coin? Is there a fee? Is there, how are people and why are people incented to participate in the network? And what are the roles that they might participate in? Again, those are things that have to get all spelled out. So you have these subgroups that form governance subgroups of various disciplines that have to come together. And could be, depending on the asset type that's being exchanged, it can be quite laborious. I've spent a lot of time in and around the Thailand government, the Bank of Thailand. And it's funny because they make it a little bit easier because they have a preconceived notion of how banks could do things like letters of guarantee or bond issuance. So they create the spec, and then, that becomes something then that gets darts thrown at, and it gets kind of works its way to smart contracts. But either way, even with the smart contracts, there's always an exception process. Right? How do you deal with exceptions? So there is this heap that says these transactions are, have to be examined, and we need humans to kind of take a look at that. That's just a natural part of how this, unless you go to a Bitcoin, which I'm always impressed with Bitcoin on how well it does its job. But then again, its job is basically simple.
It's very simple.
Right?
Exactly.
Right. So as soon as you start to talk about things like, letters of guarantee or bond exchanges or managing supply chains, I think you've automatically gone several, degrees of complexity off the charts. So,
well, you just glanced off, the subject of my next kind of question. And that is, if you look back, and we've both been through this history, that, the internet comes along and business says, oh, well, we have our own privacy and security regulations and we need to be in control and all that. So we're going to do intranets, and we're going to run most of our business off an intranet, and we're going to put all the right, protection around the areas, the edges of that. And we'll basically use internet technology, but the vast majority of the work is going to be done internally. And then we went through the whole, people will, everyone had to have two cell phones, right? A business cell phone and a private cell phone. And then we went through the, businesses will never get rid of their data centers and they'll never go to cloud computing. And, but every single time that's happened, the open innovation network has historically won out, right? That we found ways of accommodating the concerns about security and all those things.
Yeah, Doug, I would say, while you're absolutely right on that point, there wasn't a miracle that occurred that made it. It was because there were intranets experimenting, in a safer haven. Yeah. They were working out stuff. I mean, at IBM, if you remember back, we burnt the candle at both ends. We went in a very bold move, and we decided to do live sports scores at the Nagano Olympics, if you can remember that series of events that took place. And that was on the open internet. We picked a problem that was less security, had less security concerns, but it had other concerns. And people got cranky if they weren't seeing their scores updated in real time. So on the left hand said that was an appropriate problem to solve in the public internet. But then when it came to transaction processing and, how much data can we really cache? How much has to be, processed straight through processing back to the database or mainframe or whatever? We worked those out in the back office a bit on more private networks until we started perfecting the image, and then started opening those networks up once the world started having more confidence in those systems. And I'm not saying it happened that, under that much of a regiment. These things happen in some cases more organically, but, it's good to experiment on both sides. People shouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed or think it's lesser to have a private blockchain, or in many cases, a multi-level blockchain where you have some things going on a private chain, some things being squirreled off on the public chain. I think these are all great things that, unless we do, we're not going to come out the other side with that perfect answer or a better answer, I would say, if that makes sense, Doug.
Well, I think that's actually a really interesting observation. Obviously where I was kind of going with this is that, at the end of the day, who wins, right? The public or private networks. But I like your argument that says that, really, we're still going to have these things running in parallel, and they're going to be doing different kinds of innovation, right? I mean, the public open innovation network, there's a lot of collective energy and money and smart people working on really hard problems, and it has the advantage of being able to, connect to a lot of, different kinds of systems and, really leverage composability at massive scale.
Yeah.
But the privates and maybe even the consortium ones get to do kind of more focused domain specific things and do some of the learning and innovation, that are much more specific to a situation. At some point, there will be cross-pollination where those technologies and those people will go back and forth.
Doug. And I think that's the key, because it is a web after all. And a web implies multiple things, working together and interoperating. And that's the one thing here in this year we've made some strides towards, but look, there's, as been said before, there's not going to be one chain to rule them all. And I think that's a good thing. And that's, the experimentation and all of that is key behind that statement. It's good to have many irons in the fire here experimenting. However, with that said, there's chaos too because of that. There is information scattered, transactions scattered across many networks. And from a public network perspective, and a private network perspective, the reality is they're not going to converge into one. What we've seen in smartphones and operating systems, it usually comes down to a small handful, Android and Apple, kind of thing. So I think the network protocols will start to quiet down. I mean, it's interesting to see all of these Ethereum derivatives right now, like Polygon. And so they've preserved at least the nature of writing a smart contract. And that's, that works across multiple networks. So the institutional knowledge you have is transferable there. But, once a transaction is recorded on a particular, Ethereum derivative, moving it over to another, there's, not many straightforward ways of doing that. So that's something that is going to have to, move along. And there's in Hyperledger, there's Weaver, there's a few technologies out there that are exploring, how to do multi-level chain integration and the like. But I think that's a big deal because as we're both kind of alluding to is, there's going to be public networks, there's going to be private networks, there's going to be varieties of all.
Sure. And
there is no HTTP for blockchain. There is no TCP for blockchain. There is many very different protocols out there, and we need some orchestration to start making some sense out of this. And we're seeing pockets of it, like Hyperledger Firefly is another example. We're starting to see pockets of this. And I think that has to come more front and center in designs.
Okay, so let me kind of take you down to the last question I've got for you. And that is, where do you think this is going to really impact first? I mean, putting aside DeFi for the space and for the time being, and I do think I just did a big engagement with a massive bank, and it was kind of interesting. They listed the top value propositions they have, and trust is the most important value proposition the bank has. And my question to them was, well, what happens in an environment where banks are basically relegated to providing core banking services, and they're intermediated by a whole bunch of neo-banking, neo-financial, and integration services, and the trust is kind of inherent in the underlying fabric of an ecosystem. And, that's a radical restructuring of that entire industry. And so, but putting aside the, kind of DeFi as the early one, you talk to, supply chain, but where does this impact to the point that in like 5 years, we'll be all kind of shrugging our shoulders and saying, of course, right? And, of course it works that way.
Yeah. So, I think all of the problems that we've discussed, around ecosystems, we gave examples of supply chain, digital assets, digital identity. I think the thing that has the biggest bang for the buck, for us consumers is digital identity, because I think it is the root by which all things come together. I think one of the things that I read on Unstoppable Domains website. Well, it's a pretty cool company. Some IBM friends have gone over there.
Sandy's over there now too, right?
Sandy's over there, yes, as well as Lisa Cicat DeLuca. And one of the things they say on their website is, the internet is a wonderful thing, but somewhere along the way, people ceased being people and became users. And with Web3, and like the goal of unstoppable domains is to get users to be people again. And that seems like really pie in the sky kind of stuff. But when you think about it, I think that's the goal of Web3. I mean, it gets back to, what does it mean for people to be people again? And what does it mean? Like, so when you think about like my Web3 chapter and Think Blockchain starts with welcome to the 1890s. And, the Major League Baseball league is now 10 years old, and the players and owners are already at each other's throats. We've seen these kind of labor disputes before, going back all the way to the 1800s through today, where there's an unbalance. It's not saying that companies go away. It's ludicrous to think about. But there's a balance, an adjustment in labor. And the data creators, the data possessors, the data generators, i.e. us, just like back in the 1800s, the players were saying, we're the ones that hit the home runs, that put the fans in the stands. Where's our seat at the negotiation table? Where is our cut of the revenue? So I think kind of that's what we're seeing around the internet. We all create a lot of valuable data. Whether it's our social media posts, whether it's our healthcare records or our thermostat data, that all has value to someone. The companies that are able to work with their clients like people and respect their negotiation power, to have them say that their data is their data, and get some rewards beyond a coffee credit. I think these are the companies that are going to start, and they are emerging. And I think the business models are slightly different than what we're seeing today, because now part of a business, data aggregation becomes a big part. It's, I joke around thermostat data. If someone wants my thermostat data, by God, take it. But what I see sometimes is when Google comes back to me with my Nest thermostat and benchmarks me and says, hey, you're in the bottom 40% of your neighborhood in energy consumption. Here's the 5 things you can do. So they took that data, Jerry's thermostat coin, and they've used analytics, and they've given me enriched data back that's valuable to me. And if you do that with my healthcare data, if you do that with my financial data, then you both made me a person again, and you've reimagined your services. And so, I'm vaguely answering your question about 5 years from now, but I think it's as we trend in this direction, the companies that get this right, that do that very simple thing like Google did by giving me back my data in a better form than they found it, I think that is, those are the aha moments that I think we can get blockchain. When that social media company comes out around, let's say, a quote unquote metaverse where I can bring my reputation along with me, I'm going to go to that company. I'm probably going to do business with that company or in that ecosystem over someone else's. So these are the trends that excite me about Web3. It's small steps toward it. I have a feeling. I hope 5 years is enough. But this is what excites me, Doug.
Oh, I like that answer. I think that identity is in programming we call them primitives, right? It's a core building block that if you get it right, so many things can be built on top of it. So much value can be assembled around it. And I've been doing some work with CIO of major government, and there are governments out there that are saying, they're the thing they're going to focus on, right? They've got 1,000 things they need to worry about, but kind of the core technology innovation that they're going to, really try to focus on is around digital identity. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom for a lot of the reasons that you just talked about, that we'll find all kinds of interesting ways to reimagine what it means to be a person in a digital world. Yeah. And that's really exciting.
Yeah.
Well, Jerry, we're out of time, of course. We could keep on going for hours and hours on this, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity sometime in the future to continue the dialogue. Thank you, Jerry, for sharing your thoughts with us today. And thank you all for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find more research on this topic and other topics at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. I'm your host, Doug Heinzman. We hope you'll join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.